Okay, so it's been about 2 weeks since I last made a video, but you know what? It doesn't really matter, because I won a $10 gift card to Applebee's in a raffle, which kinda makes me a bit of a hot ticket item when it comes to the ladies. In fact, so much so that my beautiful ex-wife Chili even came back to me. So yeah, seeing how I'm a guy who clearly has it all, I can pretty much do whatever I want, so for the next 30 minutes or so, I think I'm gonna do just that. Oh, hold on. My phone's ringing in. I'm not gonna edit any of this out since I know y'all love me so much, you'll just wait until I'm ready to talk. Hola, Mothercita, how are you doing today? You ready to ride the baloney pony tonight? Wait, what? Babe, you said it was over between you two. Can you stop filming, please?
A few moments later.
Okay, well, looks like I got a little full of myself just now, so sorry if I was kind of a dick, but to make sure that it never happens again, I'm gonna take a look at the entire history of video games and see if there was ever a time or two where a big company may have gotten cocky, mainly because I can't afford therapy and, well, I know nothing of the real world. Alright, so the too long didn't read of the matters, and most of the time a console maker is wildly successful, they seem to develop this mentality that they can do no wrong. And look, this isn't gonna be about every failed console in the history of gaming or anything like that, so I'm not gonna be talking about platforms like the Atari 5200 or 7800, because while the 2600 probably did give the company a whole lot of confidence, I don't think it led to the failure of its successors, but rather that Atari just didn't really know what they were doing given that successor consoles were kinda uncharted waters at the time. The NES, however, was wildly successful, and even though the Super Nintendo did have some of its steam stolen from the Sega Genesis, it still definitively won the 4th generation console war in the end. Despite being in a dogfight, though, the Super Nintendo didn't stumble because it sucked or anything like that. In fact, I think it's better than the NES in just about every imaginable way, with assloads of games that still hold up just fine to this very day. However, once it was time for the super duper Nintendo, the above average sized den got a little cocky, and as a result got spanked pretty hard in the 5th console generation. Don't get me wrong, the 64 was successful and did have some great games that paved the way for 3D gaming as we know it today, but they just jumped on the CD bandwagon like everybody else, and the console would have been way more successful, because the cartridge-based games being a far more expensive hassle to develop for, most third-party developers bombarded the PlayStation with so much support that it could have filed a friggin' restraining order. In fact, you could probably argue that this crack in the door is what led to the PlayStation being as big of a deal as it is today, because if the PS1 wasn't the obvious place for games like Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII, then I doubt the console sells 100 million units. I'm not saying PlayStation would have died for sure if the 64 used discs, but the success certainly wouldn't have been as big had most of the big third parties not viewed Nintendo's console as such a pain in the ass. A lot of people within Nintendo were concerned about using cartridges at the time, but nope, they thought that because the Super Nintendo and NES were the champions of the world that they could do no wrong, and that third parties wouldn't have a choice but to blindly follow them to the Great Vajonas.
We follow you blindly to the Great Vajonas.
Sure, a lot of people are gonna berate me over the idea that I'm saying the PS1's way better than the 64, and I mean, I do like the PS1 more if I'm being honest, but to quote the wise Scott Steiner,
"The numbers don't lie!"
The fact of the matter is that the PS1 outsold the 64 more than 3-1, and the main factor is ultimately that Nintendo got cocky after being on top for so long, not only in the console market, but also in the handheld world as well. They probably just considered the success of the Genesis to be a fluke or something like that, and ironically enough, the decision to stick with cartridges over discs stemmed from when they were actually working on the original PlayStation with Sony as an add-on for the Super Nintendo, until the above-average size den put the kibosh on the whole deal due to Sony wanting a little more profits than they were willing to share anyway. Like, most businesses would have privately severed ties over a disagreement, but not the king of video games, Nintendo, though. Nah, they decided to let Sony go ahead and announce the partnership, knowing damn well that they were going to refute it the next day and reveal that they'd formed a new partnership with Philips, a partnership that ultimately go nowhere with the Super Nintendo. Then after seeing that games like Yoshi's Island and Donkey Kong Country were doing better than the likes of Sonic CD and, Night Trap, and got kinda soured on the idea of putting games onto CDs, at least for a while anyway. However, since Philips already had a deal with Nintendo that allowed for 1 Mario and 3 Zelda games, it went ahead and released a CDI against Nintendo's will, which delivered such classics as Hotel Mario and what some guy named Gary claims to be the greatest Zelda games ever made. Nintendo may not have created the CDI out of cockiness, but the CDI's birth was definitely a result of it, and not only did that flop hard and sully Nintendo's 2 biggest IPs, but the arrogance also gave birth to their biggest competitor, the PlayStation, after Sony were made to look like complete fools and decided to use the video game knowledge they learned from Nintendo to get revenge. I guess in a way, the PlayStation and CDI are kinda like Nintendo's bastard half-brothers who resulted from getting drunk off of their own hype, with the CDI growing up to be a loser without fatherly love, and the PlayStation being fueled by hatred and being a massive success, but still ultimately never happy. Nintendo's cocky mistakes during this time period weren't just limited to home consoles, though. Over on the handheld side of things, they were lighting ass with the Game Boy, so to buy more time for the 64, they decided to rush the Virtual Boy out, which some would argue wasn't meant to be a successor to the Game Boy, but first off, it did have boy in the title.
Do you like boys? Well, no, don't answer that.
And secondly, it was marketed as a portable, so suck it. I mean, I know most people wouldn't believe that, but I legitimately brought mine to game day at school in the 4th grade, even if I don't have pictures to prove it, so it did technically have portability, and therefore is kind of sort of a successor to the Game Boy, and a cocky one at that. The Genesis might have roughed the Super Nintendo up a little bit, but in the handheld market, Nintendo were the undisputed kings of the world at the time, so they thought that they could do no wrong, and that people would just buy the Virtual Boy because of the logo, despite the literal neck and head pains it caused people. Nintendo was so cocky during this time period that they literally risked lawsuits to release a console with only one decent game and nothing else in its entire life cycle. So yeah, it's no surprise to anybody outside of the creators that this thing died after just 6 months on the market. Even though the Virtual Boy brought mostly pain and misery to this world though, I will admit that I actually really liked the double D-pad. Now, sure there really weren't that many games that warranted this, but I don't know, I just think it's neat. Needless to say, though, I don't think the Virtual Boy is a product that can be released by any company who isn't completely arrogant, but I feel like we're being a little too hard on Nintendo, so let's take a look at some of Sega's cocky blunders, because Lord knows there's no shortage of those in gaming history. Like I said before, the Super Nintendo got a run for its money with the Genesis. In fact, the Genesis was actually winning that fight for a good chunk of the 4th generation, and would have had Sega just not done anything at all, but nope, they instead decided to indeed do just about everything they could have, including release the Sega CD add-on that was expensive and ultimately pointless unless you wanted to play the most overrated Sonic game in the history of the world. As much as I love cartridges, and believe me, I love cartridges, CDs were clearly the future of gaming at this point in time, but it was a little too early to pull the trigger, which is why Nintendo pretty much gave up on the Super Nintendo CD add-on altogether before Philips shredded off with it. But as if the CD add-on wasn't enough, Sega went full exhibit and gave the Genesis yet another add-on with a 32X going back to cartridges, because I mean, that was so 3 years ago and 1 year from now. I mean, after all, how can someone not buy a product with Sega's logo on it? I mean, they're Sega. They do what Nintendo don't. You know, release add-ons. Pointless ones, no less. Hell, there were even mediocre games that required both of these add-ons. Just imagine playing these back then when you could have just played Comic Zone or Yoshi's Island with regular-ass hardware. To be fair, Sega did smarten up enough to realize that releasing the standalone 32X, aka Neptune, was a bad idea, but that didn't stop them from releasing the Sega Saturn ahead of schedule at $400 in 1995, which, adjusted for inflation, is about $67,614.13. Give or take. We don't need to launch the Saturn with a new Sonic game, or any other notable game for that matter, said Sega Japan CEO Ricky Sega. This is the true successor to the Genesis that everybody used to love so much. Well, turns out almost nobody bought the Saturn, and this cocky mistake was one too many for the company to recover, because even though the Dreamcast had tons of things going right for it, it was too little too late, which is why they never made another console again to this day. Somebody who did make another console, though, was good old Nintendo, who finally learned that fitting modern games onto cartridges just wasn't gonna fly, so discs it was for the GameCube. However, due to paranoia of piracy, Nintendo just had to be weird like they always do and use mini DVDs instead of just regular ones. But even though the smaller storage capacity made development a pain in the ass for developers, I won't harp on this aspect too much since I don't attribute it to cockiness. And besides, who doesn't love these tiny little discs?
I said discs.
What Nintendo did get cocky with on the GameCube, though, is the fact that they almost dared third-party developers to make games for the PS2 and Xbox by not even trying to accommodate them. No, seriously, it's almost as if they thought the 64 losing so much market dominance was some kind of a fluke and that they'd be unstoppable this time around. After all, they were still dominating the handheld market, so it's not crazy to think that they had an ego at this time, but it's pretty insane to think about how hard they let it flare up on the good old purple lunchbox. Don't get me wrong, I love the GameCube. It's one of my all-time favorite consoles, and Nintendo had every right to be cocky about their own first-party lineup that had pretty much every IP you could ask for, along with some new ones on top of that. However, in December of 2000, just months before the GameCube launched, Nintendo's general manager publicly stressed that they weren't approaching third parties to make games for it. Instead, they expected third parties to be the ones who come to them once the GameCube's install base started growing. Again, Nintendo's first-party games ruled, and usually they do carry pretty much every Nintendo console, but with the PlayStation being on such a roll, you'd think that Nintendo would have wanted to have some more games as a backup in case casuals view games like Luigi's Mansion as a disappointment for not being Mario, Mario Sunshine as a disappointment for basing the game around a water pack rather than being Mario 64 2, and Wind Waker as being a letdown for having cel-shaded graphics. Personally, I loved all these games, even back then, but I also know that this is how a lot of average gamers felt, because almost nobody in my high school had a GameCube. Hell, I even got heckled for having one myself. So, you know, maybe it'd have been nice for the GameCube's sake if it had a few more third-party games outside of the ones that Capcom offered. It was bad enough that Nintendo were dicks to third parties, but they even let Microsoft snatch a developer Rare up from them when they had the chance to buy the company themselves. I mean, this is the same company that made the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on the Super Nintendo and pretty much bailed the 64 out of being a complete disaster with games like GoldenEye and Banjo-Kazooie. But nope, apparently they didn't even attempt to lock the developer down in the GameCube era, because apparently Nintendo doesn't need games outside of whatever Miyamoto-chan's got cooking up. So no matter how you look at it, it was pretty dumb of Nintendo to not pursue any third parties, but as if that wasn't bad enough, in August of 2001, just 1 month before the console launched, Nintendo of America's top marketing executive Peter Main stated that Nintendo's focus wasn't on maximizing the number of developers for the GameCube. Then Satoru Iwata flat out said that Nintendo does not believe in overwhelming third-party support. My, how times have changed. Was probably the worst quote of them all in regards to third-party support on the GameCubes when Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi said that it's not a race to see how many, and I quote, useless companies you can get on your side. Like, yeah, that may technically be true if you take the statement literally, but the thing is that most companies capable of developing a console game back then weren't exactly useless. I mean, sure, some of them were, but for the most part, you had to kind of know what you were doing to put a game out. Not only was Nintendo's arrogance causing them to be so in-your-face to third parties, but they were even charging around $11 per game in licensing fees versus the $7 to $9 that Sony and Microsoft were charging. So if you were a third-party developer at the time, tell me which console you'd rather make a game for during this period. The PS2 that was owned by around 8 times as many people with cheaper discs that could hold more storage and executives that weren't publicly heckling you on top of lower licensing fees? Or would you have rather picked the GameCube that did have slightly more powerful hardware than the PS2, but all that other crap that I just mentioned? Well, if graphical power really meant that much to you as a developer, then you probably would have just went with the Xbox anyway, because even that had a slightly higher install base than the GameCube, so once again, Nintendo shot themselves in the foot because they still believed that anytime they underperformed, it must have just been a fluke. Thankfully, Nintendo learned their lesson to treat third parties much better with the Wii, and I know that some people might consider the outlandishness of the Wii to be an example of arrogance despite it being a success, but I consider this to be more of a desperation move than anything else. One that paid off, but still a desperation move nonetheless, although that's neither here nor there. However, after 2 of the all-time greatest console runs in history, even Sony started letting success get to their heads as well when it came time for the PS3. If anybody ever had a right to be cocky, it'd be Sony during this time period, but no matter how good 2 back-to-back consoles may be, following them up with a console that cost between $500 and $600 in 2006 was just destined to be a spoke in the wheel. But I mean, hey, if the last couple of consoles were 2 of the highest selling of all time, then maybe charging more for the next one isn't such a bad idea in the long term. After all, even if it sells fewer units, the higher price should mean that it'd be more profitable, all things considered, but in order to get more juice in the Xbox, Sony'd sell the PS3 at a $200 to $300 loss per console, even with a high retail price, with the strategy being that they'd make the money back in the software sales. After all, for the people who could actually afford this bad boy, they'd get the greatest console gaming experience of all time, so surely they'd buy tons of games if for no other reason than to flex, right? Well, yeah, admittedly, the PS3 did have a lot of great games, not to mention it was the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market at the time, but to this day, Blu-ray never really replaced DVDs like how DVDs completely murdered VHS tapes, and thanks to the fact that Sony was hell-bent on that dingus cell processor, developing games for it was a pain in the dupa. Pros of the cell processor is that any developers that could actually learn to use it and be able to get better visuals in the Xbox 360, but the problem with that is that it'd take years for most developers to get the hang of this, so when the 360 wasn't that much less powerful, it just made sense to build your games on the Xbox and then just kinda shifted to the PS3, rather than neglecting the Xbox that more people owned in the beginning, just so your games looked like an ass hair better on the PS3 as an exclusive. I'd imagine it was way easier to copy and paste a game over from the 360 to the PS3 than it would have been to spruce it up a bit, or to downgrade and optimize PS3 game down to the 360. Not only that, but after the PS3 tripped at the start of the 7th generation console race, they released a newer model that wouldn't lose them as much money, but in order to do that, they had to sacrifice the backwards compatibility to PS2 games, which pissed a lot of people off. Half of them for not being able to play their PS2 games anymore, and the other half out of principle of having something taken away from them. Now, they sure did ask for a lot of money, but it wasn't along the lines of, haha, we know you're gonna buy it no matter what, so just give us more money, you scum. It was really just them trying to ensure they had the most powerful console on the market so they wouldn't lose their spot as the leader. But still though, the fact remains that they knew the higher price would be less appealing to the consumer and banked on the fact that they're Sony that everything would work out, and in the end, all the games looked the same anyway, so really, there was not really a point to the cell processor. If you still doubt that Sony was arrogant during this time, then just take a look at the original Boomerang controller. Seriously, look at this thing, this is what they were gonna sell to us. Make no mistake about it, this is a stunt that a company would only even attempt to pull off if they felt like they could do no wrong. It's not as bad as the Virtual Boy, sure, but it is still in the same ballpark of bad logic, and like, yeah, I know they didn't end up releasing the Boomerang controller after being roasted into oblivion for it on the internet, but still though, this made it past the drawing board, so I can't just let Sony off the hook for this one. With all the PS3 struggles though, you'd think that the 360 would finally get that big dub over Sony, and for a while everybody thought this was a sure victory given the huge head start that Microsoft had. But despite losing the initial sprint, Sony actually ended up winning the marathon before it was all said and done in the ultimate tortoise versus hare finish. Hell, the PS3's win came so late in the 7th console generation that to this day, there's still tons of people who actually think the 360 won. A lot of people blame the 360 running out of gas on the fact that literally half the consoles on the market stopped working with the infamous Red Ring of Death, and yeah, that certainly didn't help matters, but in my opinion, what really caused the 360 to duke its pants right before the finish line is the fact that the console really only had a handful of exclusives during its entire life cycle. Red Ring of Death's awful, sure, but I wouldn't consider that to be an act of arrogance, because no company on Earth would ever be arrogant enough to think that releasing a product with a 50% failure rate, or a 50% success rate if you're a glass half full type of bloke, would ever be a good idea. Yeah, I know the Kinect was ultimately a steaming pile of nothing, but it's not fair to call this a move of arrogance just because it didn't really catch on the way Microsoft hoped it would. I mean, it didn't bomb or anything, but nobody really cared, and people damn sure didn't want to pay extra for it, but with the Wii tearing ass around the backyard at the time, it only made sense to try to rip it off, and I do have to give credit to Microsoft for at least trying to do their own thing, unlike Sony, but that's neither here nor there. Then again, though, I can't consider this to be a move of cockiness either, just a bad idea, really. Like, even if you want to punch me in the dick for suggesting the 360 didn't really have that many exclusives, you can't deny that there really wasn't a whole lot of variety in the games, at least. So yeah, the 360's cockiness is pretty much the exact opposite of what the GameCube did, in my opinion. The GameCube relied too much on its own first-party games, but the 360 relied too much on everybody else giving them games. To be fair, though, I might be wrong about the 360 being cocky. It might have just been silliness. What is without a shadow of a doubt arrogant, however, is the reveal of the Xbox One being a complete catastrophe in 2013. With the 360 being such a big hit, people couldn't wait to see what Microsoft might possibly have in store for the 361, but rather than giving us an affordable console with amazing graphics and games you could let your friends borrow, Microsoft thought they had enough clout that they could just give everybody the finger and sell consoles out the ass, and boy were people not ready for this at the time. See, the initial idea for the Xbox One is that it was supposed to be a console where physical discs would be tied to one account, meaning that once you were done with a game, you couldn't sell or even let your friend borrow it. Might not sound as insanely preposterous as it used to, given how complacent most gamers have become with being forced to keep their games in digital-only consoles, but back then, this was an incredibly bold move to pull off, especially considering how hard the digital-only PSP Go proved the concept had flopped not long before in a stupid, albeit not arrogant attempt for Sony to go all digital. Look, it's one thing to have a console that's digital only, because I know there are a ton of benefits to digital, but like, if you're gonna have a console that takes physical media, then you can't just strip all the good stuff away from it. It'd be like selling chicken without the skin or a Honda without the H on the hood. Like, what's even the point? And to make matters worse, the old Xbox was originally not even going to let you do anything at all unless you connected to the internet at least once per day to let Microsoft know that you weren't up to any funny business. So if you lived in a rural area or didn't remember to pay the internet man his $50 in a Slim Jim, then you weren't going to be doing anything with your $500 next-gen console. I mean, sure, most people did have internet, even at the time, but to this day, there's still plenty of people out there without a solid connection, which is why you randomly see video rental stores in small redneck towns. A lot of people were pissed off about this, and understandably so obviously Microsoft had to say something on the matter, right? Well, they did say something alright, and that was that if you didn't have a good internet connection, then they did have a product for you called the Xbox 360. What a dick. And as if it wasn't bad enough to not be able to play your brand new console should you not have internet for whatever reason, the original plan was to also not let you play without the Kinect hooked up as well. Some people were afraid this would be used to spy on them, but regardless of whether or not that's true, my main problem with this, and everybody else's for that matter, is that nobody really wanted the Kinect forced on them. Like I said, it was harmless for the 360, but dumb as hell to force on the consumer when there weren't really any games that warranted it. Well, I mean, not any games that people besides soccer moms actually played anyway. Needless to say, Sony immediately assured gamers that none of this malarkey would be taking place on the cheaper PS4, and they even rubbed it in Microsoft's faces to become the heroes of the gaming world, even though they were probably going to implement the same policies had Microsoft gotten away with it. Kinda makes me wonder if Microsoft would have doubled down had Sony been the ones to do their E3 presentation first that year with all kinds of DRM policies. I mean, after all, once the threat from the Xbox One was neutralized, Sony did become arrogant again by banning crossplay and forcing censorship, so I'm pretty much convinced that they'd have jumped right onto the DRM bandwagon if the 360 hadn't given them so much trouble in the previous generation. I mean, hell, I don't even think the PS3 had officially surpassed the 360 yet at the time of the Xbox One and PS4 reveals, so they were probably pretty desperate to beat Microsoft at all costs at that point. Even though Microsoft immediately went back on their draconian policies and not letting people share games or even watch their timecop DVDs without an internet connection, the damage had already been done, causing the PS4 to slaughter it for that generation. I mean, after all, if you caught your waiter spitting in your oatmeal, then would you really pay to have him make another one for you? Despite the Xbox One's reveal completely nuking the bed, though, it did still end up selling about 60 million consoles, which is really nothing to be ashamed of, especially compared to Nintendo's 2013 successor to the ultra-popular Wii titled, not the Super Wii, not the Wii 2, but of all the possible names you could have given it, the Wii U. More like the PU, am I right? See, during the exact same era where Nintendo's Wii was hot enough to outsell even Sinbad DVDs, I'm not wrong! The above-average size den also had a handheld that was actually outselling the Wii called the DS. This dirty little thing right here had eaten the screen fruit, which gave it an extra screen that had touch controls for the more gimmicky games, or something as simple as maps or inventory for games that were a little more traditional. And on top of that, it also came with a built-in microphone that could do things like get you lightheaded filling balloons up in Mario Kart or ruin a snowboard kid's game. But all in all, this handheld was able to please a pre-smartphone casual market and actual gamers at the same time, despite being unable to swim, so it makes sense that Nintendo would try to combine this with the Wii's motion controls to make some sort of a super console. Sadly though, much like a botched fusion, what we ended up getting was definitely not what the below-oversized den had in mind. I mean, yeah, there are two screens with this giant tablet controller, and it does have built-in motion controls along with a long overdue but still outdated graphical upgrade, so, you know, there is that. But unfortunately, this thing just never caught on for enough reasons that I can make even more videos on the topic that I already have. First of all, this thing looks exactly like the original Wii, and with a name this dumb, most people who didn't keep up with the gaming world on YouTube probably just thought it was one of the 78 accessories for the original Wii. Hell, I'm sure plenty of people who did watch gaming videos on the internet didn't even know this thing existed. Honest to God, to this day, I don't even think most people know what a Wii U is. I mean, seriously, just look at the name Wii U and tell me Nintendo wasn't cocky when they came up with it. I'll bet anybody within Nintendo who opposed the name Wii U got laughed out of the room for questioning the company who could do no wrong, except for all those times where they did wrong. Well, let's be fair here, as big as the Wii U gamepad is, it's actually somewhat comfortable, and surely Nintendo learned from the mistakes of the Virtual Boy and wouldn't release an outlandish platform if there weren't games to take advantage of the system's quirks right off the bat, right? Like I said, I'm a fair man, and to this day, I'd bet my dad's ass that Nintendo Land would actually be a ton of fun. Now, I've never actually played it myself, not because I didn't own the game, because I most certainly did. I still do, but I used to, too. But because I've never actually had any friends who'd play this with me, or do anything else with me because I'm a strange-looking full-grown man with a small peep. But my point is that Nintendo Land's a good example of why this Nintendo console needed to have this gamepad. But that was friggin' it. I mean, sure, Kirby Rainbow Curse was built around the gamepad, but it didn't really feel like a game where the devs said, oh boy, we can finally make the game of our dreams. It was just kind of, oh, I guess we could make another Canvas Curse game, so why not? Game & Wario utilized the gamepad decently, all things considered, but that game was incredibly short and apparently not very good, so for the most part, the Wii U just offered regular old games that you could have just played on any other console. And yeah, some of them were good, like damn good. In fact, good enough to port over to the Switch and sell out the ass. But there's never anything on this console that convinced anybody why the gamepad controller was necessary. Like, sure, having some perks like maps and occasionally being able to take some games with you to the turlet did improve the experience a little bit, but not enough to warrant paying what I'd imagine would be like an extra $100 to $150. Like, if you're gonna have a tablet that only a handful of games use, then just have it be an add-on, not a mandatory feature for the console. But nope, Nintendo was so certain that it'd be the next big thing, despite barely making any games that even considered using the gamepad. Hell, Nintendo didn't even think to have any other games for launch outside of the fourth by-the-numbers 2D Mario game after having just put one out like a few months earlier. And then Reggie was like, I don't know what people want, we gave him Mario. And look, I'd be lying if I said I didn't like this 2D Mario game more than most people do, but even I wouldn't launch a brand new console with it in 2013 with nothing else. Like, hey, come buy the Nintendo Wii U with a revolutionary gamepad that'll change the way you play video games forever. Oh, cool, what can I play on it? Well, the biggest game we got is a 2D Mario game like the one you played in the 80s. Now buy it, you kook! Speaking of launching new hardware without any games, though, the Nintendo 3 Dual Screen was the official follow-up to the original DS. It was pretty much the same thing, except with better graphics this time, and with stereoscopic 3D that nobody ever used, but I mean, it was still a nice feature. It also used near-field communication that exchanged information with other 3DSs you'd come across in the wild, which would usually give you bonuses in games, especially for the Street Pass titles that were built into the system that I probably loved more than I should have. This would incentivize you to actually take your 3DS out in public with you, thus making it more portable, and there were also built-in gyroscopic controls on top of all this. Like, let's be real here, the original DS was just about perfect. Like, sure, some of the games weren't built around the idea of having an extra screen, but even so, it never felt like a hassle just having it like it did when Wii U games didn't bother using the extra screen. So with the 3DS pretty much just being a regular DS on steroids, you'd think that nothing could go wrong, and well, to be honest, this just might be my all-time favorite gaming platform ever, all things considered, but even I can't deny that the friggin' launch was abysmal. Eventually, this console ended up getting a 2D Mario and Zelda game, a 3D Mario and Zelda game, Fire Emblem, Pokemon, Metroid, Smash Bros, Mario Kart, Kid Frickin' Icarus, and an incredibly underrated 2D Pikmin game. The 3DS really did have it all. Like, usually Nintendo consoles missing like one or two of their key IPs, but nope, the 3DS had everything. Eventually, anyway. But as for the launch, well, I hope you like Steel Diver and Pilot Wings, cause that's about all you got for 6 months. By that point, Nintendo had to slash the price from $250 all the way down to $170 just in the hopes that somebody would actually buy the friggin' thing. Hell, Satoru Iwata even cut his own salary and have to punish himself.
Tell me I've been bad.
Yes, you've been acting up lately.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Make good on the people who bought the 3DS early, though. Nintendo gave them 10 free NES games that wouldn't be officially released until way later, and 10 free Game Boy Advance games that never ended up being released for the console at all. And oh yeah, they did give this little ambassador program that pretty much just exposed you for being a Nintendo fanboy. You bought any console they made, regardless of whether or not there were actually any games on them. After the original DS barely fell short of being the greatest selling console of all time, Nintendo thought that the 3DS was going to be even bigger than Chris Farley's ass. I mean, eventually it did end up doing pretty damn good, if I do say so myself, but I remember eagerly showing up to GameStop to pick mine up at midnight, and the store didn't even bother having a midnight release. So then I drove across the street to get one at Walmart, and the guy was just like, "There's a new Nintendo system?" That's the first I ever heard of it. Alright, let me go check.
10 years later.
Hey, you know what? There actually was one. Here you go. Do you want any games? Then I was like, hell no, big dog. Even I'm not a big enough loser to play Steel Diver for the next 6 months or so. And then sadly, I just played regular DS games till Mario 3D Land came out. Seeing as how cell phones stole the casual gamer, the 3DS was never going to reach the same numbers as the original DS did, but had Nintendo not been so cocky to assume that everybody to be as dumb as me and just buy a 3DS blindly on day one, and instead had a launch that was an ass hair more impressive, then I think it would have sold significantly better in the long run. Despite the 3DS stepping on a flaming bag of poop during its launch though, it did still have a significantly better life than Sony's Vita that directly competed with it at the same time. You see, Sony's first attempt at the handheld market with the PSP sprayed so much ass all over the place, so it only made sense that they'd want to put a successor out. Only this time, they meant business. I don't want to say that they didn't try with the PSP, but I don't know. It just felt like the launch of the Vita had way more put into it as far as hype and awareness goes. The PSP just kind of popped up out of nowhere. At least that's how I remember it anyway. The internet was seemingly convinced that the Vita was just gonna wipe the 3DS's ass all over the place, because I mean, after all, this thing was like a portable PS2.5-ish. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, unfortunately for Sony, they too didn't think that anything could possibly go wrong, which, as we've learned by this point, means that everything went wrong, and boy did it ever here. Make no mistake about it, the Vita is an excellent portable. It was sleek, had a great interface, touch controls and gyro, better launch titles than the 3DS, and obviously the most important aspect of a portable, it was powerful. I mean, sure, the most powerful portable's literally never been the best selling, but surely this time it'd be different, right? Well, as it turns out, the Vita's power made it way more expensive to actually develop for, and with games being sold for about $40, most developers didn't really think this was even worth it to try. Even the ones who did usually just made console games on a portable rather than a high-end game that was meant to be played in short bursts. However, that mistake wasn't really a matter of Sony being cocky though. They knew they were in a competition with Nintendo and thought that spending more on power would help them win in the end. Not exactly what I'd classify as an act of arrogance, but what can only fall into the category of cockiness though is the price of those goddamn proprietary memory cards. I mean, sure, $250 at the time might have been a little steep for a handheld, but to be honest, that was pretty fair for something like the Vita at the time. I mean, after all, it was about the same price as the 3DS and had a better launch lineup and more power. But the number one thing that really ruined the Vita was the fact that the only memory cards that work on the damn thing were these special ones made by Sony that costed $30 for a measly 4GB card, $45 for an 8GB card, $70 for 16, and $120 for 32GB. But if you want to save any of your games, then you might want to consider picking one up. And really, you don't have any choice if you plan on downloading anything at all. I mean, could you imagine if memory cards on the PS1 were like $50? The key here is that Sony didn't have to use these proprietary cards even if they say they did. They could have just as easily used regular old SD cards, but nope, they thought they'd trick people with a seemingly reasonable price for a handheld, and then ripping them off with memory cards that wouldn't have even crossed the average person's mind. But hey, these fools already bought the system, so it's not like they're gonna not buy a memory card to be able to play their games now, are they? I'd imagine that a lot of really innocent Vita adopters found themselves in this position and were just put off by the entire thing, 'cause even though the price was legitimately fair, it just felt so damn sneaky. With decades worth of video game history, and way more than that in general human history, you'd think that all these big companies would have learned a long time ago that being on top's never a given. But apparently the meaning of life is to be a cocky turd whenever possible, and the only way you could ever even dream to get away with that is if you're on top. I mean, I should know, I did get a little carried away with that $10 gift card from Applebee's, and if I ever get my hands on another one, I can't promise I'm not gonna act that way again. But anyway, if there were any cocky video game blunders throughout history that you felt like I should have talked about, then feel free to berate me about it in the comments. But if you liked this video though, then you should check out my video where I roast Atlus for letting me date a 10-year-old in Persona 3 Portable, the cameo from Hansen. If you'll excuse me though, I'm gonna go use the last 8 cents I got left on my gift card to have a below standard meal. Later!